Hi everyone, great to have you back. All right, in this video we'll be talking about controllers and REST controllers. All right, so I discovered that uh, this basically trips up some developers. All right, so I want to basically make some very clear distinctions so you can know exactly what you're using for what, right? And if you're asked an interview question, hey, what are controllers, what are REST controllers, you know exactly what you're actually aiming for. All right, let's get into the video. Okay, all right, so we have the famous project Everything Spring Boot. Okay, so let's just go in very quickly. All right, let's just create something very simple to be able to illustrate this point, right, and try to nail it on the head. All right, so I'll go in and create a package. I'll create a package and just call it controllers. Just call it controllers, right? And I will just come in here and okay, so let's create one. Let's create a class. Okay, so I'm just gonna call it test controller. All right, I create a test controller and I'm gonna put in at controller, right? That's what I'll use at controller. Then I'm gonna add my request mapping at request mapping to just have something basic, right? I'll just put in a path, then I'll just place in test. Now, please note, some don't like using path, right? I enjoy using path because it actually affords me the aspect of not using the forward slash. So that is the difference, all right? I hope you understand. So if you're using path, you don't need to put in forward slash. Automatically, it basically prepends that for you, right? So if you're using something else, so let's check the other options. If you're checking the options and you're placing things like value, right, and you're placing like test, you'll be necessitated to place this in. All right, so I try to go for the simplest option. So I prefer to use path. Okay, so let's create a controller. So I'm just going to say at get mapping, right? And I'm going to do public string, and I'll just call it test. I'll just add in return test. All right, so let's get into it. So before Spring Boot 2, right? Before Spring Boot 2, what we had was controllers. There was nothing like REST controller. I want you to understand that. We had only controllers. There was nothing like REST controllers. However, when the transport system came about, when we needed to use REST, right? And remember, REST is not only JSON. REST could also be XML, right? When you needed to use REST, there was a necessity for us to basically create a way to be able to transport this data. That is why the concept of REST controller came in Spring Boot 2. So I'm trying to basically differentiate it. That is why if you see legacy code that are written in Spring Boot 1, you would not see REST controllers, because all they had to deal with was controllers. And more so, we had coupled systems then. And the coupled system, meaning you had front end and back end within the same application. So most often times, there was no need for you to have JSON. You just needed to have things like model view controllers. So let me quickly demonstrate that for you to see how it works, right? So now we've created this. I'm trying to simulate as if I'm running a coupled system. Then let's go ahead and create this view. Now, this is a view in itself. Now, if you're familiar with Spring Boot 1, or you actually write, you're a full stack engineer, you know that when you're developing with Spring Boot, all you just need to do is this, and you don't need to put the .html in front of it. So let's go in and create the templates. So you have templates under resources. I'll just go in and create test.html. That will basically correspond to this. Now you can see there is a line here telling me that it can't find this, right? Because I'm basically using controller and a REST controller. So what I will do, there's a shortcut for you guys that develop HTML. Just basically bring in the exclamation mark and press tab, right? Exclamation mark and tab, and that brings in this, all right? So I'm just going to say in the title, I'm just going to say test document, right? And I'm just going to place in a div in here, right? I'm just placing a div in here. I'm placing a div in here. I'll just say repping the backend, because I'm all the way backend, right? That's in the backend community. I'm all the way back end, right? I respect you guys at the front end, but I enjoy back end more. All right, so we're just repping the community. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to be showing. Now you could see this is still not recognizing because it doesn't even know what it is. It cannot resolve the MVC view. Reason being that I have not added another dependency that is required. Remember I mentioned when we started dealing with that Spring Boot 4 that things have been modularized. So you need to bring in the right dependency that would work for this. So I'll go to my POM. The same way you go to start.spring.io if you don't have the ultimate version. You just go in, then let's go to the starter. So I'll go to the starter. And under the starter page, I'll just bring in Timeleaf, right? So let's just bring in Timeleaf. And if we can see, this has been added for us, which is Spring Boot Starter Timeleaf. All right, so I'll just go in and reload. Just go in and reload. All right, so this has been reloaded. Now let's see. Let's go back to our controller. Can you see? You see that the squiggly lines that was under there turned to should I say a solid line, right? So if I do a command click, it's able to actually rep this or show this as a rep. It's able to actually show this. So quickly, let's just run this and see the output, right? Let's enjoy the feeling. All right, so I'll just go in and run this. Okay, so now this is coming up. Now, a get mapping, so I can just basically call localhost 8080 and test. Remember, if you don't put anything in here, it basically just refers to test, right? Right. So, or I could just probably just put in another path here so you could understand the process and just say me. So I'll put test me. All right. So let's bring in a browser. So let's bring in a browser. All right. So this is a browser. So I'll just say localhost 8080 test, then me. Right. Okay. I think there's an error. Okay. So let me see exactly what is bringing up the error. All right, so we have the paths, we have this. So let me see. Let me quickly see. This is 8080. Okay, this is coming in properly, and this is test. Okay, and this is referencing this correctly. All right, so let me see what is happening in here. All right, so let's try to run this again. Let me just refresh my Maven. Let's stop this. Let me delete my targets. Let's be sure that everything came up correctly. Okay, and I have this under templates. All right, so I expect this to basically work. All right, so I think it's just caching. Remember, Spring basically caches your HTML. So if I do this and run it again, let's refresh. You can see I have repping the community, right? Which was the exact same thing I placed in here. What's this part here, repping the community. I hope this is basically clear. Now, for those that were developing in Spring Boot 1, the question now is, how do they make, in case they want to return JSON, right? They were just thinking of returning JSON. How would they make that work? If they intend to return JSON, what they will do is something like this. They will have, let's do a get mapping. I'll just make it simple. I'll not use post because I believe you guys are familiar with post. I'll just basically just put this in. I'll just say, let me just make it so that we'll know that we are returning JSON, right? I'll just say JSON me. So let's just say JSON me, right? And I'll do a public. I'll return a map in this case just to make this simple. I'll just return a string and I'll return a string. All right. And I'll just say test JSON and I'll just return this. All right. I brought in my imports. I'm going to return, then I'll have map of. I'm sure you guys know that map of, once you cross the 8th, either the 8th entry or the 10th entry, this will not work again. So you have to use the new hash map, right? So for if you have probably relatively small details, like probably lesser than 8 or 10, I think it's 10. 10 is the cutoff. Lesser than 10, you can use it. But if you're greater than 10, use the new hash map. So let's just bring this in. Let's just complete this process. I will say name Z. All right, name, that should be a comma, sorry. Name Z, then I place in age, I'll say 62, then height is a comma, say height, I'll just say 185, right? 185. Then what else? I just say hair color. hair color and just say black, right? Okay, now as you can see, I've been able to bring this in. Now I want it to return JSON. So if you're basically coding in Spring Boot 1, what you will do to get this to work appropriately is to basically add as response body. You have to add as response body. So labeling this with as response body is saying, now I want to return JSON. Even though I'm within a controller, I can return a JSON. So this will tell Spring that, hey, I am not expecting you to look for a template, right? This is a JSON, because the moment I place this in, it means I want it to return a REST. Sorry, not JSON, a REST. I want it to return REST, a REST data, and that's basically what it does. That's basically what I'm looking for. But if you have this, it will be looking for a JSON. So it will be looking for a template. All right, so let's restart this. Let's restart this, and let me go into, bring this in, then I'm going to test. Let's test this again. You see, repping backing company is still working. Now let's go to JSON me. Oh, sorry, JSON me, ME. You can see. Can you see? So this shows that I'm returning this, and that was possible because I added this. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Okay, so let's remove it. Let's remove this, and let's see how it works. So I'm going to remove this. Let's restart this. Then let's bring in our controller. So our browser, and let's run this again. Can you see? There will be an error. The error because it can't identify. See? Error of resolving template. It's looking for a template because it's expecting this to basically return return a template, because there was no there's no response body. But if I add it back in and do my restart and go ahead and hit this, you can see this returns. I hope that clarifies, guys. So this is how it works in Spring Boot 1. However, Spring guys now label, okay, now that we are dealing with a lot of, now REST is now common. People are now using a lot of REST. So how do we ensure that we don't have to be typing this controller, we don't have to be typing this at the same time, which is what gave birth to what you famously know for new developers, REST controller. So let's go in and duplicate this, and I'll call this test controller 2. I'll call it test REST controller. Now, that is what gave birth to this, which is the REST controller. I hope that is clear, guys. REST controller. So anything you place in within this automatically is expected to be REST. And you can see Spring is already complaining, saying, hey, you don't need this anymore. You see? Remove this. You don't need this. You don't need this. Remove this superfluous response, because apparently it is already contained within the REST controller. Right? Now let's run this again. Let's run this again. Aha. Okay, it's actually okay. The reason is because it sees this part, Okay, so let's call this test rest, and let's run this, because the parts were actually conflicting. All right, with this in place, let's go in again and run the first one. See, everything still works. We still get this. Now let's go in and run the JSON me. We're going to test everything. You see, this still works. Let's go in and now put test rest. Test rest. Basically, test. Okay, test. There's a T missing. Test rest. You can see this basically works without me adding the response body, because it's already contained in here. And let's test the ME. You see, it just brings it because apparently it's not probably a map. So it's not an object, so you can't basically know how to map it. But I hope that clarifies, guys. This is exactly how it works. Now, what differentiates a controller and REST controller? That is where we are going, guys. So I'm then going to bring in and then inspect controller. I'll then go in and inspect REST controller. And then let's bring it in side by side. Controller and REST controller. Can somebody spot the difference? If you look at it carefully, you would see that REST controller is just a controller plus response body. I hope that's super clear, guys. REST controller is just an alias for controller and response and response body. So what it means is here, while you were doing controller and response body, you were practically saying this and this, I want this to be done rest, which is the summation that gives you rest controller. So you can see controller, controller, response body, response body. I hope this example is clear. So this is why you use rest controller, and this is why you use controller. So those that actually just develop with templates use controller, and anytime they return they need a JSON data, they will add that response body. But if you're sure that everything you need, not JSON, rest data, anytime you know that you're just strictly returning rest data, which is more common now for the decoupled systems we have, we use rest controller, which is a combination of controller and response body. I hope this is super clear, guys. The same reason, I want you guys to know, the same reason, we're not going to delve into exception handling because that's not the goal. The same reason is why we have we have the annotation that brings in. So let's just go in here. I don't want to separate it, so let's just go. Let's create a package here called exception. Exception. Then I'll go here and I just call. I'll say global template advice, or global template handler. Then I'll go in here and create another one, which is the global template rest. No, not template now, because we don't need, it's not template, it's a global rest handler. So I'm trying to prove to you guys, if you now check the templates, you would have noticed when you're dealing with Spring Boot 1 and the likes, you always use at controller advice. At controller advice, right? Then you then put in your exceptions to catch all the exceptions, what have you. Then for these, which is the famous one that is now using Spring Boot 2 and the likes, you now have at rest controller advice. Let's go ahead and inspect both also. So I'll bring this in and I'll bring this in. So if you go in here and you check, what can you see? It's simply that rest controller advice is an alias for response body and controller advice. So if you are dealing with rest alone, that is why you use rest controller advice. And if you're confused, if somebody has forgotten what's rest controller advice, that is the case where you then bring in at exception handler, right? You now bring in something like this, right? That then catches your exception. I hope this is familiar now, right? Where you have your exception handler, the type of exception you're catching, and something like this. In this case, I can just return response body. In this case, I just return response body and this. So I'm basically not wanting to implement this. So if you want to test this out, I can just go in here and just call something that will basically throw an exception. I'll just say JSON X. Let's just call it JSON X. I'll just call it JSON X. Then I'll just return a response entity. So response entity. Yeah, I'll return a response entity. Response entity. Yeah, I'll return a response entity with a T. Let's say with a map, right? Because I intend to, it should have key value pairs. With a map, I'll have a string, and I'll have a string. All right. So let's see, this is fine. Then within this part, I'm returning a map of. You can't return a direct map because I'm using response entity. So you need to actually wrap it around. You need to basically wrap it around something like response. You can either say new response entity, right? And right, or you could just basically use response entity directly.ok. Response entity.ok. So you can have something like this, and that basically clears it out. All right, I hope that is clear. Now, because our goal is to throw an exception, I'll just from here, I'll just throw new runtime exception. I'll throw new runtime exception and just put in a message, yo, an exception. Yo, an exception was thrown. Right? So I'm just going to throw this, and you can see it could not reach this part again because I'm already throwing this exception. So I could go ahead and just comment this out, right? Because apparently this would always be thrown, right? This will always be thrown. If we want to actually make it more dynamic, what we can do is let's just add a path variable. So we can add a path variable. I can just say I'll do this and we'll place in, and I will place in an ID. just pass in an ID, then I'll have a path variable ID. The ID names must match. If you want to make this a different name, it means you have to make the value something else, right? I'm sure you guys are aware. Placing, let's say, my ID. So if you are placing this as my ID, the name has to be my ID for these two to match. That's how it works. But if you want the string name to match directly, you could just place this, remove this at value directly, and this would match what we have here because they're the same. All right, so let's go ahead and comment this out. Or rather, I said I wanted to use the ID, so I would say I'll make it an int. So I'll say if ID equals to 1, then throw an exception. All right, so let's do that. So that would help us achieve our goal. Else, if ID is equals to 1, throw an exception. If it's not equals to 1, it will basically return this. All right, so let's go ahead and rerun this. But before then, I'll go to my REST controller advice. Now, there'll be a conflict because I have controller here and I have REST controller. So let's just comment this out, right? Let's comment this out. I'll use this as an explanation, right? Let's go to REST handler. Then I'll go in. I want to return something better rather than just the exception.message. I still want to return a map, right? Let's return a map, right? A map of string and string. Right, so we can do this. So instead of the exception, so I'll just bring this in and just say I'll return a map.off, and I'll say error, and I'll just wire it within exception.message. I hope that is clear. So let's run this again and let's shoot it up. All right, so let's test this part out. So I'm gonna go here. I'm just gonna pass in JSON-X text, then I'll do JSON-X, right? See the error, no static resource JSON-X because I couldn't find it. So let's go in and add a path variable. Let me use 2. Basically, it will run because it's when it's 1, it throws an exception. And let's put in 1. As you can see, an exception was thrown, just like we have defined. All right, in this video, I've been able to clarify exactly how you could have what is the difference between controller and REST controllers, controller advice and REST controller advice. I hope this helps you out in your next project and in the next interview. All right, guys, I'll see you guys in the next video.